the Center for Faculty Excellence. My pleasure to be here today. The title of the webinar suggests, I think it really is a methodology that can help students align their design with their research questions, and I think it's something that perhaps we want to consider and think about, do more talking about it and more study on it. And Cheryl Keene, Susan Marcus, our presenters today have some really great information, some resources, some background information on basic qualitative design. Also with us today is Mary D. Spillett from the Center for Research Quality. Mary D. is going to be monitoring the chat, taking a look at your questions, and helping to answer perhaps some of those process things or some of the things about the university policies, procedures, and such to help you clarify issues as they come up. So before I turn it over to the presenters, just a few housekeeping things. First of all, if you've not been in an Adobe webinar for a while, or if you've never been in one, a couple of things about what you're seeing on your screen. The big box in the middle is the PowerPoint presentation, and that's where you'll see the content for today's webinar. You will get a copy of this PowerPoint email to you at the end of the presentation this afternoon and perhaps early tomorrow when I'm able to do that. If you'd like to follow along, the PowerPoint also is available in the small box down to the right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a little box that says Files. The first document there you can download is the PowerPoint presentation, so you can get that right now and download that onto your screen. Once in a while, or your computer. Once in a while, people have difficulty with that, and if you do, no worries, I'll mail it out to you, email it out to you. The second item down there in the files box is a qualitative approaches matrix that the presenters are going to share with us today. So when they refer to that, you may want to download and have that available. Again, if you have trouble downloading that, no worries, I will be sending that out along in that email. Over on the right-hand side, the left-hand side of the screen to the upper top, you see we have a captioning service. So if you need that, you're welcome to follow along with our captioner. Below that is a chat. We've already had some great conversation welcoming everyone and checking in with folks maybe we haven't talked to in a while. If you have questions, go ahead and post them in that chat. And as I said, Mary D. will be monitoring that and sharing those questions, asking the questions of our presenters, sharing some the answers that she has. Also, if you have experiences or comments that you want to make, go ahead, type into that. Everyone can read all of your comments and your questions, so go ahead and use that. Over on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you see an attendees list. Your presenters are there along with a list of the participants, your colleagues that are here with us today. One other thing that I want to bring to your attention is the raise hand feature. So if you click on that icon at the top of your screen there, you'll see where it says raise hand, and you can click that. If you raise your hand, I can see that on my screen, and I can call on you to verbally ask your question or share your experience. If you're on voice over IP, I can activate your microphone. If you are on the phone, you'll just have to dial #6 on your keypad, and then you can share verbally with everyone. As I said, I did mute everyone on the phone, so in order to share verbally, you will have to do that #6. Just kind of prevent some background noise and making sure that we can hear our presenters. Last thing I wanted to remind you, we talked about just briefly in the chat, we are recording this session. So in the email I send you, you will receive a link to the recording. So just know that, what we're talking about here today is going to be recorded, so you can go back and review that, share that with your colleagues any way that you'd like to use that. We will have a repeat session of this webinar in April. So there'll be another opportunity for you to come back and revisit our conversation, or to invite folks you might know who might be interested to come to that. So with that, if there's additional questions you have about using Adobe, or if you're having some technical trouble, go ahead and type those into the chat. I'll help you. Mary D. will be answering your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl, who's going to start visiting just a little bit about our objectives for today. Cheryl?
Okay, I'll do that. And I just want to go back to the title slide. Whoops, I can't get there. And thank people who have supported this project. Oh, Laura, you gotta get me back to the next slide.
I'll get you there, Cheryl. Hang on. I'll get you there.
So, here, a lot of people have put work into this project with me over the last year, and Susan being one of them as my co-presenter. So we got 2 schools here, education and psychology. But Alice Eicholtz and I started on this a year ago, and we've been talking with Mary D. Spillett and Laura Lynn, and Barbara's helped us from psychology, and Annie Pizzella when she was responsible for the finishing up the design of the advanced qualitative course in the PhD program. Most of us know she was reading abstracts at that time, so she was eager for this project to move ahead. And see, is it slow changing my slides, Lori? What's going on here? So if we can get to back to the objective. So first of all, I'm delighted. There's 67 people here already and 110 or so signed up, so we know that there's a need and a curiosity about this. So we want to understand, well, some of us are talking about basic design, and when we say basic, I want you not to think about that as an adjective which means simple or, you know, the essentials but no window dressing, right? So I'm sitting here surrounded by the textbooks that we use and refer our students to, and there are many names for this basic, generic design, interpretive description, but we think we'll be able to help you see why we see the elements of this qualitative approach as being as rigorous and appropriate in a well-designed, well-aligned study. So we want to talk about when is it appropriate to use the design, the different ways that it's called, the nomenclatures, what are the characteristics, and particularly when and how it might get mixed up with phenomenology and case study design, some of the pros and cons, red flags about that, problems to avoid, and then there's a bunch of resources at the end that you all can dive into later. Okay, now I can change the slide. Right, so we're going to poll. So why did you come today? So, Lori, how does this poll work?
Okay.
We're giving you 5 choices.
Yep, on your screen you're going to see a poll. And let me just get that up here for you.
So we figure with so many people, we wanted to have a good sense of where people were coming.
So here on your screen you have the question, share your experiences with basic design. So let us know.
And if any of you are in something other than the PhD program, could you type that into the chat box so we become quite aware that maybe our framing of this and our reference to experience and coursework and textbooks comes out of our PhD experience. So we want to make sure we're appreciating at least the different backgrounds people come with. So we see lots, 35% of us have a little experience and some questions. That's good, and the same number want to work with others to develop it. And a smaller number have no experience but are curious, so welcome. And oh, good, 15% of us want to share a successful experience you've had, which you can do in the chat box, and if we have enough time, we can do orally if you raise your hand. And one person has some concerns. Well, we hope we address those later on. And if there's additional concerns, we'd love to hear them as we continue to iron out issues that may come. Okay, Lori, that's pretty good enough. It's not changing. As we know with quantitative design, once you get, 60 people or so, the percentages don't change that much. So I'm willing to go ahead. Thank you. And thank people for typing in what program. I see we have several EDD folks. And I know some of the nursing faculty were going to come because they're getting continuing credit. Okay, so from our PhD experience, so we know that sometimes we call our students who've been with us for a while legacy students, but many of them worked with the Creswell textbooks, which featured 5 approaches. And some of us who've been here for a while started to notice that our dissertations were falling into these 5 categories. But if you know Miles and Huberman's work and all the SAGE publications, there's 100 kinds of qualitative design, right? So Susan and I have been concerned that our students and our faculty, we maybe fell into these 5 approaches, and Creswell just didn't work with the generic or basic one like our current books do. So these are the texts that are now being used in the PhD program. And Susan, could you talk about this and the courses and how they're handling it?
Sure. Thank you. And again, welcome everyone. And I'm seeing in the chat box as well PhD and EDD students, and as Cheryl said, that we also appreciate that other programs and other doctoral degrees may use different courses and different textbooks. So we're just presenting this as a framework for how we have shifted over the last couple years to include the basic qualitative design into the training and development of the students. So as Cheryl said, in the previous iterations of the course, using the Cresswell textbook compelled students and faculty as well to think of qualitative research choices as one of 5. And which is, in addition to not always being appropriate given the research question, is not consistent with the field and the discipline of qualitative research methodology. So part of the impetus for shifting this was to allow Walden students to become more aligned with what was going on in the methodology and the discipline of qualitative research. So as a consequence, we shifted our textbooks to content areas which focused on what are the dimensions or key, what's the word that I'm looking for, the key elements that make up basic qualitative research and are also fundamental to these other specific kinds of approaches, and also incorporated basic skills for conducting qualitative studies. So these include conceptualizing what we mean by qualitative research, conceptualizing where the role of theory comes in, what we mean by sampling, what are the tools and the instruments for data collection, the tools and choices, and then how to handle data once it's collected. So the Ravitch and Carl, Rubin and Rubin and Saldana textbooks all focus on basic skills, which for the most part can be applied to some of the other approaches as well, but give students in the 8310 and in the PhD and EDD courses, this is the first qualitative research course they take, the first course that they take. These give them a good grounding in the basic skills and techniques. Okay, and thanks, Joanne. I see you're in public policy, so thanks for sharing your expertise areas. I'm trying to click to the next slide here.
Okay.
Oh, there
you
it goes.
go.
Good. Okay. So the 8310 is the first qualitative course. The advanced course, 8360, comes as students are moving towards their dissertation. Here we include Patton, which is another graduate level textbook that expands the choices regarding approach, methodologies for data collection, methodologies for analysis, as well as a deep dive into how to do interviewing, which is what most of our students do regarding data collection for their qualitative dissertation. So again, focus is broadening their base of understanding as well as doing more in terms of the skill set of interviewing. The other part of the course, I should say, includes, and this is where we start to turn towards the different approaches, like narratives, like ethnographic, and we broaden, instead of Cresswell's 5, we broaden into 8 choices, which include basic qualitative design as a choice that students learn about. And we don't advocate at this point or include as a required reading a particular textbook to align with a particular approach. Rather, we expose students using both articles and citations from texts of ethnography, narrative analysis, phenomenological studies, etc., to educate them that once they make a choice, regardless of what that choice is, basic qualitative design or any one of the other approaches, that they have to become subject matter experts in the method as well as subject matter experts in the content of their dissertation. There's a question there. Are these books available in our library? I don't have the answer to that, but it looks like Mary D. is responding. Thanks.
And some of these books also you can find online into chapters of them easily, which is one way, this is Cheryl Keene again, that I sort of educated myself about this last January when I had 3 or 4 students who I had supported to use basic design, but got a little pushback from a couple URRs and realized that we didn't have enough shared understanding of this as an explicit and acceptable method with its own references. So I've been thoroughly educating myself, and the matrix that you see in the bottom right-hand corner is a result of that, and then asking my faculty peers in other schools to help me embellish that and add some additional resources. So I've been sharing this with my students, and they find it very helpful, and it's continued to educate me. So you see in the middle bullet here, just in terms of how these got, the breadth here, the Ravage book that we use and the basic qualitative design lists 10 chapters, which you can find in the table. Patton uses 16. He calls, I'm going to flip. Let's go to the next slide, and you can see how these different scholars of methodology use the word. I'm going to go back here. So here's the nomenclature and some of the references for the different words that are used to describe this method. Susan, if she'll just back me up a little bit, we could talk about why we feel that these are in the same family that we put under basic design. And one of them is that they do have a theoretical basis. Most of these textbooks will talk about constructivism. That we're inviting largely through interviewing, we're inviting participants to tell us how they understand an experience, how they perceive it, not the deep lived experience, but just how they make meaning of an experience. So we're asking about their construction of knowing, how they make meaning. And these textbooks mention that more or less along the way. I think the interpretive description, Sally Thorne's incredible book that's very well used in the nursing world, is very explicitly a constructivist approach. Susan, anything else you want to say about the nomenclature?
Yeah, I do. And this is not atypical of nomenclature in qualitative research anyway, or I think in research anyways. It's like even in quantitative research, we'll use the same word to mean different things depending on the context, and then we'll use different words to mean the same thing depending on the context. So this is part of what we have to help students negotiate, and by including this language, you as faculty getting familiar with the different ways that these words or these terms are used to mean the same thing, I think will be helpful, and also to inform our students. The things that these different names have in common are across all the important elements: epistemology, theoretical framework or philosophical stance, like constructivism, methodology, in other words, the research strategies, and then methods, the particular techniques. All of them are consistent in what they describe, and that we'll get into next.
Okay, so just to go back, so Sharon Merriam, who writes often for the education world, so our students might choose her book as their sort of first of at least 3 references to document why they chose this. You know, she talks about researchers who conduct these studies are simply seeking to discover and understand a phenomenon, a process, or the perspectives and worldview of the people involved. It's not a bounded system, so it's not a case study. We're not planning on developing a theory from the results, so we're not talking about grounded theory. And we're looking for recurring patterns or themes, so the coding typically is moving from codes to categories to themes. And typically, you would want to have more than one interview to understand people's experience in a problem setting, problem. So we're also differentiating it from narrative. So
could I interrupt for a moment to relay some questions?
Yes, please.
Kelly Hall is asking if I had to choose one reference to share with students, which reference would you suggest?
one reference. Well, I think that might depend upon the school. So I might start with Miriam because she's her writing is very clear and she has kind of a short description. But I haven't taught out of the Ravage book myself, but many of our students are now going to own that Ravage book. So that might be the place. Although they make a point to say in that text, we're not going to sell any approach, right? We're going to talk about the skills, like Susan said. So it may not be the best. Patton does a very nice job on pragmatic, but Patton's a little more esoteric, and it's an expensive book, so our PhD students won't get it till the advanced course. Sally Thorne is, which the nursing world is using heavily, is I get so excited when I read it, but you have to stick with the book. Like if we send our students to read a theories behind phenomenology, this Sally Thorne book is like that. Like you cannot walk away without a deep understanding of why listening to other people make meaning is a legitimate approach. So I'd say go with the Miriam. And the chapter, I found it, the chapter online recently for free. So that might be a way to go.
Yeah. And I would say, I think Miriam's a great book. I do. I also think again, it depends on what you want to refer your students, what the intent is behind a good source book for referring to your students. We chose the Ravage and Carl book for our beginning qualitative course because in addition to including a pretty good dive into the epistemology and ontology of qualitative research. In other words, where students stand, where a researcher has to stand in order to begin a qualitative inquiry, which is probably one of the biggest struggles that most students have because they're enmeshed and immersed in a quantitative, positivist, or post-positive world, and their language around research has been mostly in terms of what's the relationship between variables, how do I determine if a program is effective, does this treatment work, how do I change people. That the biggest challenge we have in the beginning qualitative courses is turning the Queen Mary so they get to see what is this playing field they're working in. And I think the Ravage and Carl book does a really great job of that, as well as then giving guidance on, basic tools, basic skills, and how to put a study together.
So I'm looking at the question Salvatore asked about Creswell. Isn't Creswell just a generalist? No, I've been here 12 years, so what I've seen is, and we used to use his advanced qualitative book as well, is that he just stuck with these 5, the ground theory, narrative, phenomenology, case study, and what am I forgetting? So he said, I have to simplify this for you guys if I'm going to teach you effectively. So unfortunately, our students would often I think, kind of cherry pick from the 5. So Creswell just simply has not used this basic generic frame, and I think undersold the power. And if I could go back, somebody's got our slides going to back to the beginning, but I would like to just tell you a little autobiographically. Laura, you might need to get me out of this title slide here.
Yep.
Why? So we're going to go back to research questions in a minute, but well, no, let's stick with the order. We'll stick with the order because we have so much to share with you folks. Yeah, so, okay, so the purpose, we're all using our checklists. Our rubrics and our checklists are so helpful, so our students want to know about purpose. So the questions typically are very straightforward questions, and it's not necessary to have an explicit theoretical, but we talked about this a little bit, tradition that underlies it, although it's typically constructivist. And so here's sort of a skeleton basic research question. How do individuals experience something? What are the practical consequences and useful applications of what we can learn about such and such a phenomenon? And I have some examples of research questions a little bit later that we'll get to that I think will help you know. And within this world of basic, with my students, I've probably done a dozen of these with students, as well as my own work in the 1980s when this was basically the go-to method. It's typically interviews, maybe complemented with focus groups, and triangulated, often with the research journal and among the interviews, researcher's journal. So, Susan, you want to add anything about data or purpose?
Nope, that's good. You're good.
Okay. Okay, so here's, just to go back, when would we guide our students to suggest they consider this as appropriate? So one, it's practical and flexible. It helps us address problems, right? So often our students are so driven by problems, and we encourage the social change orientation. When a scholarly systematic method of inquiry can be applied to address that problem, and we talk at residency so extensively about alignment. What is your research problem? We're talking about the construction, how their perceptions and experiences relate, what we can learn from their experience. We think it's wide-reaching for all of our disciplines. And one distinction I am making with students, if the research problem they're approaching is not an intense one, that the participants haven't had an intense one, that might require multiple interviews, or a different kind of interviewing question would suggest phenomenology. If this is more about more of a practical problem in the world, that basic design might be better. So sometimes what looks to me like phenomenology light, L-I-T-E, right, it could have, should have been a basic design, and they really don't need to read the Clark Moustakis and other theorists of phenomenology because they're trying to solve a practical problem. And then there's another set of suggestions that Paula Dewitowicz has been using in her teaching, and also in my school. You want to know some opinions, perspectives, and experiences? Go to basic design. If you want to know something about something, but it's an unbounded setting, consider basic design. If it doesn't fit a specific tradition or a variation, and also make sure that your research questions are cohesive. This is not permission to scattershot research questions. And of course, we're always looking for alignment. We're glad you came because we think this will help our students align their studies better. And sometimes they get all tied in knots at the perspective stage because they're trying to fit a shoe, into a box, or a box into a shoe. Okay, here's some considerations.
I just want to, Cheryl, can I just add something to the list there, that occasionally students will find in their research problem statement, in their research gap, an area of study where a qualitative endeavor has never been, or has not been done well as part of their research gap. And so using a basic qualitative design is exploratory. In these other designs, you have to know a little bit more specifically about what you are looking for. But in a basic qualitative design, it's in response to a research gap where previous research has looked at things quantitatively, but we've not dived into the experience, the perspective, the opinions of people who have experienced a particular phenomenon, or have been part of a particular event, or have participated in a particular program. So it has more of an exploratory component.
That's good. And if we take Diane Dusick's question that just showed up in the chat, she asked if DBA students are asked to find strategies to address a problem, what else could she use besides a case study? So one might be this question about the boundedness of a setting. If a variety of stakeholders might have ideas about a strategy to address some problem, that it's a setting, is it bounded, and there's justification for that wide reach of stakeholders, then basic design might work very well. Case studies, you need that sort of place where everybody's referring to the same life experience they've had with addressing a problem in an organization, perhaps. The people who are having trouble with audio might just need to hang their phone up and start again. So, okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So there are some considerations that come up. So here's an example of when I think phenomenology would be justified. Let's say if we were going into rural Puerto Rico right now after the hurricane, it would require a lot of listening. probably to understand what that experience is and to think who we're going to communicate that with. So if we think we don't understand it's such a brand new experience, no research has been done, and we want to reach out to a whole bunch of people, maybe not just one village, that might be a case study, but what is a wealth of problems that we need to hear, perhaps basic. There is, as you read the literature, and let me suggest you'll see the references at the end. Many of them are journal articles, which I urge my students all the time to get their nose out of books, out of methodology books, and read Sage Research Method website and try to find articles that talk about this, because some of the best sources I found on basic design are shorter articles that are talking about it. So this one of these articles by, I can't say Kelke, about methodological mixology, sort of more, do you have to have a purist approach, or can you put the framework of a method in your back pocket and put the people's experiences in the front? So that's something your students would justify and navigate in their Chapter 3 justification for the choice that they made. And other scholars are advocating pluralistic approaches, which is let's be realistic to the needs of the world. Let's not pick an approach because we think it's beautiful and it's elegant design, but let's find an approach that helps us understand the problem and the setting that we're trying to address. Susan, and as you've maybe even reading the chat, are there some other, could people share with us if there's any confusion regarding alignment that we could address regarding this? Is this an opportunity for a little pause? I know I talk very fast.
Yeah. Well, I can say one of the things that I see, and I review qualitative prospectuses for the general, for the academic psychology programs, and one of the things I see students get confused about regarding alignment is how they ask the question, the approach they choose to take, and then the data that they choose to collect. So there's a lack of understanding between how of those different components fit together. And phenomenological research has a particular alignment with respect to what goes into the research question, what goes into the particular data collection methods and the analysis plan. And when you see a student sort of fumbling around like that, I think the important thing is to go back to the question, what do you really want to study? How is this going to address a gap in the literature? And let the question emerge first and see if this kind of approach, a basic approach, or the others is more relevant, is more consistent.
And Cheryl Christensen said that,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I was saying, do you find that some students might be drawn to qualitative because they might be uncomfortable with other methodologies? Gary's question. The answer is yes. I think, right. You know, students will say, I want to do qualitative because I don't like numbers, because I've heard qualitative research is easier, because I don't need as big a sample. So yes, so those are all, you have to, you know, consider those kinds of questions as part of students' basic intrepidation about taking on what for most students is their first research study. And granted, Walden is doing everything with the revised research curriculum, with the revised residency research curriculum, with all the great resources and tools that students have available now that they didn't have even when I started in 2011. There's a phenomenal amount of work that's gone in to help students be as comfortable as possible, having as many resources as possible to start their dissertation. However, we do have to keep in mind that most of them have never done research before, and they have to do it in isolation. So the fears that they identify are perfectly normal, and we have to address them with them getting grounded in what they can do, which is both consistent with a scholarly work and feasible given what they have to work with, that they're not associated with some big research center where they have access to multiple researchers and, you know, and everything like that.
I'm going to go back to an earlier point that Cheryl Christensen said. that instead of using the word alignment, she uses consistency, and I agree with you. Sometimes I'll just, at residency, I'll hear us say alignment 20 times, and I'm not sure they're getting it. And I've been trying, like Cheryl, I've been trying the word functional, sort of helping them see the function of each element in the design, each aspect of Chapter 1 or Section 1, and that I think also helps them see, oh, how the framework, the research problem, and the design, each serving a function that will help me get to where I am, as well as helping me design my interview questions and analyze my interview questions. So Mary Dee and I are asking Agandu on the quote about multi-layered interviews or more than one interview, and I haven't had any trouble in an IRB approval process with getting 1, 2, or 3 interviews through. Sometimes more than one is required, although often I might look and see, well, is that really a phenomenological study? I think all of my basic generic design students are collecting adequate amounts of data in one interview, often with a follow-up if they didn't understand something, and certainly with member checking of the transcript.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I'd like to point out on this discussion question is I think there is also a place of confusion in terms of what students can state with regard to the significance of a study. In other words, when you're working on a basic qualitative design, the intent is to help understand what people are experiencing around a particular phenomena or an event or a program. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've generated something that's actually going to be able to solve a particular problem. So the confusion is, what is it that I can take from the results of my study? And how can I apply them in a way that's both meaningful and grounded in the context and the boundaries of the study? So we can't solve the world's problems. This is a big message to our students. We can't solve the world's problems, and we know this, with one study. But we can let those study results take us to the next step.
Right. So here we have a slide. I think we've addressed when grounded theory might be better. I hear talking about the deep dive and narrative and phenomenological case study when it's maybe more bounded. Okay, so here let's maybe talk about some sample research questions. And 30% of you are on the line having had experience with this. If you want to share the nature of the research problem your student tackled or some framing of the research question, that would be really great. So Lily, who just passed her proposal last week with Alice Eichholz and I, is what are the experiences, not lived experience, what are the experiences of tenure-track women engineering professors regarding family formation and child rearing and their perceived impact on achieving tenure? Now, the reason I think this is not phenomenology, although these women probably have huge life stories to tell. One, they're too busy for multiple interviews. She's going to be lucky if she can get these incredibly busy women with engineering professors, with women who are trying to get tenure, right, to spend even one interview round with her. There's a practicality of that. We know the problem because they represent only 15% of the population of engineering professors. How can we have more women for more gender balance? But this question goes for something. The researcher wants to know something. She wants to know the perceived impact on their journey of achieving tenure. So she's not listening for their entire life experience, their lived experience, which that's a very broad research question. She has a problem she wants to solve and facilitate. So here's James Burrows. I got this from Public Policy, I think. How do first responders describe their experiences in emergency situations that involve the lack of communication interoperability? So once again, it's a particular aspect of the problem that the researcher wants to know about and probably has some life experience to help them sort of, that help them frame and understand intelligently what the other person's saying, so they're not opening up to a whole broad range of experience. And Joanne here, maybe somebody can catch up with Joanne, is saying, and Mary Dee's offered to help anybody at the IRB, or people can go to IRB office hours to help with this. I think some people are just on the phone, so I'm going to read one more here. What is the role Again, that's very specific. The role of budget and training in connection with communication interoperability and the policies that might be instituted to improve the safety of emergency responders. So again, very focused, very explicit. Under this would be a very explicit research problem. These are both from education. I'm going to read Dr. Rebecca Stewart. She graduated last year, and it is the most succinct qualitative dissertation I've ever overseen. What are the lived intercultural and career advancement experiences of African American mid-level women at predominantly white institutions? So she wanted to know about career advancement in particular. She collected very rich data in just one round of interviews and then had two other questions. What are the perceived influences, that's a targeted question, of intercultural relationships on the career path, and what are the mentoring experiences? So she wasn't going to wait around and see if they mentioned mentoring, and she wasn't going to dive deep into mentoring. She was going to make sure she asked everybody about mentoring, more in a explicit data collection process, whatever that was. Welcome to any questions. Okay, Cheryl's saying she's been told that there should be 2 research questions in phenomenological research. What are the lived experience and what are the perceptions? That's not my experience. I think one might do with just the lived experiences because you get perceptions from that. Paul Engelsberg might comment to that. So here's been, and Susan will have her own experiences, but my challenges in implementing basic design or any qualitative design. Worse, if students have weak interviewing skills, many of the qualitative designs could come up with very thin data, so I make sure that in the advanced qualitative course they're practicing, and IRB has supported students doing trial interviewing with people who are not possible subjects, not data collection. I read their first 2 interviews, the transcripts. I coach them on doing a better job with interviewing. So I do my best to get over that no matter what the design. And often when I read interview questions, I find they read like a paper pencil survey, or like a health practitioner goes into a home to ask somebody who's has had a heart attack. They're much too direct, if not leaving enough room. And this possibility of method slurring, so we want to be clear the questions are right. Susan, do you have a comments on data collection, that there are challenges?
Yeah, can you go back to the slide? Yes, weak interviewing skills. Challenges in basic data collection. I think the biggest one is developing the interview guide itself. And we've tried to, again, this is in the PhD research courses, that we've tried to address that by giving students opportunities to develop, get feedback, and then revise their interview guide. This is particularly in the advanced course, and then try it out on a peer or a colleague or another student in their class, so they can get the feedback from actually doing the interview. I will say, in my experience in teaching these courses, that the most frequent feedback that students give after having this in vivo experience is, I didn't ask questions that would allow the person to talk about their experience. I was looking for a particular thing, but they had something else to say, and I probably missed it. That my questions were too narrow. So getting experience in developing and reading other basic qualitative design, reading books about interviewing and developing interview questions is really critical to doing good research. And this is true of, qualitative or quantitative. It's all about the data, ultimately. If you don't get good, rich data, there's nothing to analyze.
So from my education in the 1980s, from some of the best qualitative interview researchers, I learned the power of asking a very broad question first. Can you tell me about your experience with such and such? Listening, urging students to listen first to, well, what do they say? What is their experience? And only then probing if they don't mention grandmothers or whatever it was their hunch or what they thought they wanted to hear. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And my other basic coaching, to students is because most people will speak conceptually, but if you get people to speak about a particular experience or event, and a probing question like, can you give me an example of when that happened or how you felt that way? And then once they start telling a story about a particular experience, then the other questions about the meaning of that experience or the richness of that experience just unfold. And that's another basic challenge to students who don't have the experience, who are doing this, just doing any kind of qualitative research for the first time.
Madeline Blair asked what we mean about methods learning. This is one of the, when I read the literature, when people, researchers in this field want to refer to the critiques of BASIC, they'll often refer to this one very powerful article that's in our reference list about methods learning. And I don't buy it myself. I mean, I think the critique is that we want researchers to have such a distinct and pure methodology that BASIC doesn't have some, basic design, generic doesn't have some of those elements, so it's just borrowing in a sloppy way from other sources, where from my, this is from my own experience of my own, the book that I wrote where we interviewed 150 people, right? We didn't even have, at that point, and in the 1990s, we weren't required to call it a certain approach, right? We rested on the skills and the alignment with our research problem. The book that really shaped my doctoral work, Women's Ways of Knowing, if you know the book by Mary Belinkie, Jill Terrell, Nancy Goldberger, and a fourth author, they interviewed 256 women who were in learning settings, from mothering groups to graduate students. It was such a powerful book for the field of adult learning. And by careful listening with, one-round interviews. And I don't consider it sort of methods learning that they consider what is the best way to address our problem. So I think we're trying to avoid being demanding purism of ourselves or our students. We just want them to justify with a variety of sources. So we have 15 minutes left, and we definitely want to listen for any other questions that come up. But this is the biggest red flag I have found, and the work I've been doing as URR and some of the other materials I've seen, which is students calling a phenomenological study. One like this sample research question: how do people over 60 years of age describe their decision to retire? Sub-question: how do they describe the barriers? Sub-question 2, how do they describe how they overcame the barriers and they're making the decision? So I see this as a basic design research question and sub-question because of its focus on their decision to retire, not the whole experience, and going after the barriers. Often we see barriers and challenges, right? They want to know, this researcher wants to know something in particular. So I think that's trying to address a particular problem, and that the lit review would justify focusing, and the research problem would justify focusing on the barriers and overcoming barriers. Susan, is there anything else you want to talk about? Examples of?
I'm sorry, I missed the slide because I was typing there. Yeah, I was replying to Joanne. One of the things we want to be careful about in suggesting students doing a mixed method is that if they're doing a quantitative study, but they want to ask participants, say in a program, and they're collecting quantitative data, they want to ask students a couple of open-ended questions just to clarify some things, that's not necessarily a true mixed methods approach. Although the qualitative open-ended questions certainly might give some insights into some of the quantitative results. On red flags here. No, that's it. I don't have anything here.
Okay. And the other thing, if you see in the perspective that you're looking at as a URR chair, that they are proposing phenomenology, but that they're saying that the interview will last 30 to 45 minutes with a convenient sample. That really is a red flag for me, that you're going to actually hear somebody's lived experience on a great big problem in 30 minutes. So that's something to be aware of. That maybe not even for basic, but 45 to 90 minutes might be more. And then here's what I see red flags and case studies that might point to basic design. At this Paul Engelsberg, who's a URR in our education school, pointed out that case study designs where the only data is interviewing, or maybe some thin documents or convenient documents. It's nice to be able to, I think Yin, who people mentioned before, Yin and Stake's textbook, they often say, can you find, at least 3 sources of data that, different types of data that you can triangulate? And also, can you get all the data that you can that's adequate to describe a setting, a bounded setting? Or if you're only interested in participant perceptions, don't call it a case study. It's a legitimate thing to understand what stakeholders or participants have to say. I think we've talked about this is another slang word that I jargon word I heard, methodolatry. Basic avoids methodolatry, I think, by saying, oh, narrative design is so wonderful, I've got to figure out how to do a narrative design.
Right.
And right.
Can I say something about the methods? Cheryl, can I say something about the method slurring? Okay.
Yeah.
This is, I want to say 2 things about that. One is I'd like to share a quote from Captain Barbossa of the first and the best Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And his quote was when he was talking about the pirate's code, when the girl, the heroine, says, bring out the code, the pirate's code. And Barbossa said, well, it's not really a code. It's more of what you'd call like guidelines rather than actual rules. And what I think we fall into in trying to educate students about the basics of research design, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, is we want to start in such a way that it's clear that what's black and what's white. What is part of the paradigm and what's not part of the paradigm. And that's great for a beginning, but particularly once students get into the literature and they start reading, they'll see how different researchers will incorporate different aspects of different traditions or different theoretical approaches in order to answer their research questions. But the integrity is it aligned with, is it guided by the research question? What you might see when the student is sort of stumbling is when they take a bit of something from narrative and a bit of something from grounded theory and a bit of something from case study and try and all put it together. That mishmash is like method slurring, and it loses its underlying integrity. And so again, we have to go back to what is it that you're really trying to study and determine what approach is going to work best.
And one reason I think our students get trapped in that is that they aren't rigorous enough in their search for scholarly sources about their method. We fail to teach them enough about how to find articles in methodological journals, so that, like this great article that I'm showing now by Sandalowski, who has 3 or 4 articles on this problem. This is such a descriptively useful article about why BASIC is a powerful method. And yes, it may come from the nursing field, but the education students could use it just as well as public health could use it and public policy. So I've been pushing my students that way too, so that they don't like just sit with Creswell in their lap and say, well, I'm going to borrow a little from the 5 methods that Creswell celebrated. So we got the floor is open. We've got 7 minutes. We'll try to finish at the top of the hour, and but you can see in the references here, I've broken down resources by the different nomenclature that's used. This here's the article on a methodological mixology by Kate Kill that'll keep you thinking for a while. This clear as mud toward a greater clarity. So this Kaylee and Bill are trying to articulate what it is, but that's a 10-year-old article, but people are still struggling away at this. And I want to thank Paul, who's probably read way more than 100 perspecti, says that the students' phenomenological studies often what they describe as phenomenology are based more on a very specific problem, decision, or challenge, and not really that broader lived experience. And Darcy asked if I could talk about the matrix. So I'll take more responsibility for this because Susan pitched in. But so in the matrix, which you can download on the bottom right corner, I sort of started this as my own adventure. And what I feel is important about it is 4 columns. I think there's about 8 frequently used, not all the qualitative methods, but the frequently used ones. Plus, we put photo of voice in that, as Barbara Benelli's suggestion, as a kind of spice. They're using more of it in psychology, but I don't think it's yet frequent. And then 2 columns in the middle, positive considerations and cautionary considerations, and then a list of references, including, as best I could find, some sort of starred Walden dissertations that use that method. And boy, I could use everybody's help as I developed this for sample dissertations, because you can't type the word basic in as a search term and come up with anything useful. So I urge you to look at the 2 middle columns, because what I have found by handing this out a lot at residencies and with my mentees, and also with the faculty that I'm leading in the new faculty in the Research Pro Seminar have told me it's useful, is the notion, as Michael Patton says in our new textbook for the advanced course, it depends, right? This is what we need our students to know in the Chapter 3 of the PhD dissertation. They have to defend why it's a good choice. They cannot cherry pick. They can't just say, well, that sounds good, or I always thought I would, grounded theory, that sounds sexy, right? No. Like, what are the possibilities here, and what do you want to get on the phone with your mentor, your methodologist, and talk about, well, what's at stake here in this decision? So, and I think that's been a little helpful. I can see students furrow brow, like, oh, I've got to think through this. I am responsible for this choice, and I just have to prop it up with, stakes. So it's a work in progress. It's just something I put together with a dozen faculty members' help.
I'd also like to throw in that, again, in the PhD program, Advanced Qualitative course, we actually have students, as their first major assignment, build their own matrix for 8 approaches, including the basic qualitative design. So we give them hints and these different columns. There are 8 approaches. There are 5 different columns. And so part of what they're doing in that exercise is learning how to distinguish the major features, the major considerations, and the major cautions of each approach. So the students are getting a lot out of the assignment, and we'll see how that shows up when they come into their prospectus and dissertation.
Both Kelly and Cheryl Christensen have pointed out that students have remembered so little of their methods courses, and I find that too, that if they rush to take the advanced methods course and they're not reading Chapter 3 at the time, that they have to go back and kind of relearn it. So they also need to come to residency in a very well-timed way to get refreshed on this. So I think the matrix in some ways has helped refresh that process. But as Susan pointed out, we've only this course has only been taught for 9 months in the PhD program, right? So we have more to learn about students' experience out of it.
Thanks so much. This really has been a great session, and Kelly, I've learned a lot. Thank you so much just listening to all your insight. We're getting lots of thanks in the chat, too. So Cheryl, Susan, Mary D., thanks so much for sharing your expertise. And as I mentioned at the top of the last hour when we started, we will be presenting this again. So if you have colleagues or if you just want to think on it some more and come and listen to it live again, you're welcome to do that. You can watch the CFE weekly email for an announcement of when that will be. It'll be probably in April. On your screen right now, you see contact information for our presenters and also the methodology roll account for the CRQ. So you have questions about the type of methodology your students are using, or resources, or any of those kinds of things. Be sure that you use that resource. They really have some good folks who monitor that roll account and who are working with us to make sure that students have the right information and are using the right resources to select their methods. Lastly, just wanted y'all to know I think those of you from the nursing program know that there are CEUs for this particular session. You'll get this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to click on that link if you can't click it on here, and you can get CEUs for this session. For the rest of you, again, thank you so much for your time and for your great questions and attention. I'm pretty sure that we're not done having conversations about this important topic. So thanks for beginning and extending the conversation. As I close out today's session, on your screen, a survey will pop up. That's for the CFE. We use that to make sure that we are meeting your needs, find out what else you'd like to know in webinars, what else we can provide for you. So if you could take a few minutes and fill that out, that would be great. So with that, just thanks again so much to our presenters, and thank you all for sharing part of your day with us, and I hope that the rest of it is good. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.